Imagine surviving not one, but two near death experiences and turning those moments into fuel for a life filled with creativity and impact. Today's guest is a master of storytelling with a staggering 58 Moth Story Slam victories under his belt and 9 Grand Slam championship. He's a novelist whose books have been translated into 26 languages, a celebrated humor columnist, a sought after TEDx speaker, and a teacher who inspired thousands. Oh, and I didn't mention, he also is a DJ and a minister. From crafting heartwarming tales like Memoirs of an Imaginary Friend to teaching others how to tell stories that change life, he has done it all. Welcome to another episode of our Founders Podcast. I'm your host, Ash, and this is a show where I interview proven founders and industry experts who share their stories, strategies, and insights to help you build, launch, and grow your business. Hello, Matthew. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Great stuff. Do you have your favorite quote, something that inspires you, you would like to share with our audience?
I do. It's a quote that I'm not quite sure who said it to me. When I was in fourth or fifth grade, so 9 or 10 years old, I was having a bad day, and the teacher came to me and just leaned over my desk and said, "Listen, a
Mhm.
positive mental attitude is your key to success." And somehow I was prepared to receive those words, and they sort of planted themselves in my brain. And I have probably said that phrase to myself 10,000 times since then,
Wow.
constantly. And I really do think that, oddly, those words continue to remind me that regardless of what kind of day I'm having or what kind of year I'm having, if I frame it properly, I'm going to be better off. And so my friends, my family, they tell me that I am the most relentless and disgustingly positive person they know. It really frustrates them at times, but I also know it's a supremely helpful to me in everything I do. So a positive mental attitude is your key to success is something that lodged itself into my brain a long time ago and has been with me ever since.
Oh my God. Thank you so much for sharing that because I couldn't relate to it more because, I had the similar experience when I was a kid when a teacher told me, Ash, you can do it. And then it stuck to my mind. I didn't even know about it. That's great stuff. Matthew, I'm eager to learn, more about yourself as a person. Can you take us back to your roots and share with our audience about your upbringing, your childhood? How did your early experiences shape your journey? And eventually you became a worldwide known storyteller. And were there any key influences from your family or surroundings that played a significant role in shaping your entrepreneurship spirit and your storytelling capabilities?
Sure. I think oddly, the thing that shaped me the most as a kid was the fact that I was ignored so often. I grew up
Hmm.
in the 1980s where kids were sort of latchkey anyway. We walked around with our own key and nobody seemed to be paying attention to us. And that was
Hmm.
very much the case for me. I was a championship pole vaulter in high school, and my parents never saw me pole vault once in their lives. I was a baseball player. My team won a championship. My parents didn't attend any little league games. They were just sort of they were parents who were very disengaged in my life in a multitude of ways. And so as a kid, I spent so much time trying to get the attention of other people, the
Hmm.
attention I felt I needed and deserved. And at some point early on, I discovered that telling stories about my life, specifically telling stories about the moments of embarrassment, the shame, the failures, the ridiculous moments of my life, those are the ones that garnered the most interest in people. And so I became known really early on as a kid as someone who was constantly telling stories. And I'm sure I wasn't very good at it in the beginning, but it wasn't long before I was sort of diagnosing and dissecting stories. When I was 10 years old, I saw the movie E.T. the Extraterrestrial, the Steven Spielberg film. And when I got back
Hmm.
from the movie theater, I was so angry with Spielberg because there's a scene in that movie at the age of 10 that I thought was the worst scene I'd ever seen in a movie. I thought it broke the movie. It was such a great movie, except for this one particular scene, that I wrote a letter to Spielberg that day telling him basically, I've seen some of your movies now. They're all terrific, but all of them seem to contain one stupid scene. And if you'll send me the rough cut of your film before you send it to theaters. I'll tell you what the one stupid scene is and fix your movies. And I
Wow.
handed that letter to my mother and said, mail it to Spielberg. And for like 35 years, I was angry that Spielberg never replied. I thought, how could he
Mm,
not reply to a kid? Even if he thought I was wrong, why not just write back? And then oddly, just recently occurred to me that my mother never sent that letter. Not only was she sort of not paying a lot of attention to me, but in like 1980, to find Steven Spielberg's address without the internet, sort of just in an analog world, there's no way she could have ever found the address to mail it to. So Spielberg never got the letter. I just recently sent him another letter telling
mhm,
him what I felt in 1980, because it still holds true. That scene in
mhm.
ET is still problematic to this day. But that moment's sort of emblematic of the idea that even as a kid, I started looking at stories and finding how they worked, how they didn't work, and how to make them better. So, it started early on for me in a way I didn't quite understand would bring me to the place I am today.
My God. Well, that's very, very interesting. And when you express your feelings with a story, it just, you don't have to remember. It just keeps into your brain, right? You don't have to like do any stuff. It's just there, isn't it?
Yeah, when you tell a story to yourself or to other people or an audience of thousands, it preserves it in your mind in a really meaningful way. Sometimes it doesn't preserve it in an accurate way. I've certainly told stories where there's an inaccuracy in it, and later on someone says, "You got that detail wrong," and I realize, wow, I did get it wrong. My wife has corrected me more than once, saying that's not actually how it happened, Matt. And we've gone back
Hmm.
and forth on moments, and finally I've had to say, okay, I think you might be right, but what I always say is the storyteller tells the story as true as they remember it, acknowledging that memory is a very faulty thing. So we
Oh, yeah.
manage to preserve what we want to remember in stories, but sometimes not entirely accurate of what actually happened. But we try. We try as hard as we can.
We try definitely. And Matthew, our podcast is purely focused for the founders, and a lot of founders after a release of episodes, they come to me and ask these questions around like how we craft our stories. Like it's very difficult for founders to actually go out and seek for investment, seek for transactions, make their customers understand what actually they're doing in terms of solving a problem. Is there a is there what is your go-to framework for structuring stories that engage and persuade in high stakes situation, like founders face nowadays on a day-to-day basis, sales pitches, team presentation, etc.
I think that, depending on what the context is, really determines what kind of story I want to tell. But ultimately, I think they have to tell a story. And I think oftentimes they're not actually telling stories. Oftentimes when I'm working with a founder, an entrepreneur, a business leader, and they're explaining to me what their story is, I have to tell them, you're just listing features. You're just
Mm,
explaining to me, oftentimes in a highly technical way, what your product does, but you're not actually placing the customer in the center of the story and allowing the customer to see a journey take place. You're
mhm,
not allowing the customer to see you as a founder with all of your flaws and foibles and problems, making you relatable to other human beings. I think
mhm,
one of the biggest struggles people have is they don't understand what a story is, which is essentially about change. It's, I used to be one kind of person or used to think one kind of thing, and then some stuff happened, and now I'm a different kind of person, or I think a different kind of thing. And for a founder, that is at the heart of what they should be talking about. And in terms of like a sales pitch, essentially you want the customer to see themselves as that agent of change or that actor of change. So they should see themselves as being one type of person and then making a purchase and now being a different kind of person. And the more different that person is, the more meaningful the difference is, the more likely someone's going to purchase their product, buy their service, invest in their company. So we have to understand what stories are, and we have to try to engage audiences in memorable, emotional, meaningful ways.
And you also touched about this point about vulnerability. How important do you think is vulnerability in storytelling, and how can leaders use it to build trust without overexposing themselves, because usually I have seen that founders, or generally people, they don't want to expose their vulnerabilities in front of audiences, right? They're really scared, they're very preserved in that sense. So how do you like manage that level of, or the ratio, how much you could share and how much you could constrain?
I would say they almost never overexpose themselves. I would say they almost always underexpose themselves. I think what you just said is completely true. When they
Hmm.
don't want to speak of themselves, they're operating from a place of fear. And it turns out that no one is interested in doing business with someone who is afraid. No one is interested in purchasing products from someone who is afraid. It is fear complete and total. And it tends to come from a place where they recognize other people are not doing it, and therefore they would rather remain in the safety of the herd and continue to do what other people are doing. When the best leaders in the world, the most bold and successful leaders in the world, they're ones who do things differently. When we're
Hmm.
looking for someone who is successful, the most successful people in the world, they tend to be very different than everybody else. And yet for others to do that, for business leaders to do that, it seems almost impossible. So I would say when I'm working with, everyone from the CEO of a Fortune 10 company all the way down to a small business owner, I'm trying to let them know we believe in people more than we believe in products. We believe
Hmm.
in people more than we believe in services. I would rather do business with someone who I like rather than someone who perhaps has the best answer to my problem. And the
Hmm.
best way to get people to like you is to be honest, vulnerable, amusing, truthful, relatable, memorable, all the things that storytelling can do. I'm not quite sure why people don't want to uh, expose themselves in these ways other than that place of fear. So I would say
Hmm.
you can't overexpose yourself. It'd be very hard to do so in the current business climate. I mean, unless you sort of have abused your animal, committed a crime, locked your children in the basement on Thanksgiving, unless you're doing things like that, people want to hear about your failures. They want to hear about the things you're doing poorly. They want to hear about the mistakes that you've made. These are the things that make people trustworthy, and it's an expression of courage. It's
Hmm.
absolutely an expression of courage that most people are afraid to do.
Yeah, yeah, and I totally agree. I was listening to Mr. Wang, who teaches, public speaking, and the phrases he mentioned about, like, fear is man. It's made by your brain. It's not something tangible. Danger is, like, you can see an hazard on this on the road, and then you could see somebody is in danger. But fear is something you create in your brain. So the more you work on your fear, the more scared you get, right? And following this point onwards, I have seen that because of that, founders make quite a lot of mistakes when they craft their story, even for, let's say, if they're going for investment, seeking investment for their startups or businesses. What are the common storytelling mistakes, in your opinion, entrepreneurs make, and how can they avoid them?
I think that there's a couple things I see quite often. One is they fail to recognize what the customer doesn't know. I was
Mm,
working with a company yesterday. Excellent company, does great work. When they sent me their website and all the materials to read before our meeting, by the time I was done reading, I couldn't quite figure out what the company did. So
wow.
if I was a potential customer looking at this website and reading through their materials, honestly, I really couldn't pinpoint exactly the purpose of the company. And it
Mm,
was in a market that I sort of operate in all the time. I work with their competitors to a certain degree, and yet I
mm,
couldn't figure out what their sort of secret sauce was. So I got on a call with the founder, and about 10 minutes into the call, he explained to me what his company did as if I was a 10-year-old, as if I was someone who had no knowledge. And when he
mm,
explained it to me as a 10-year-old, he used things like he expressed it in an analogy. He used simple language. He presented it with passion. And instantly I knew what his company did. And I was really impressed with what his company did. And it took me a little while to explain to him that nothing he presented to me explained what his company did. I think
mm,
the problem that happens so often is when you're invested in your business, when you're working every single day in your business, the things that you think are important are the things that you're working on every day. But the things you're working on every day are often irrelevant to the customer on the surface level. When I
mm,
when I look at my iPhone, right? Steve Jobs never spent a moment explaining to customers how the iPhone works, right? That was
Definitely.
not the selling point. This is one of the most complicated devices ever created on the planet. And yet I have no idea how it works. And I don't really want to know how it works because that is not why I purchased an iPhone. And
Mm,
yet, so often in business, the founders are so interested on how it works rather than what it does and why a customer needs it. That's really all they should be talking about is what did I make and why will customers want it or why will you want it
mm,
instead of the how. But because we focus on the how on a daily basis, because we get so invested in, you know, the means by which this product now exists, that's often what founders want to talk about. So they're
mm,
talking about the wrong thing. They're speaking about it at a level that doesn't make a lot of sense for customers who are inbounding for the very first time. And then they're often not talking about themselves. There's a great podcast. I can't recommend it enough. It's called The Pitch. It's
mhm.
essentially Shark Tank on a podcast,
Wow.
and it takes it more seriously. It's a more serious look at investors coming in and having entrepreneurs pitch to them. And what I'm always fascinated by when listening to this podcast is the entrepreneur, the founder will pitch their product to this group of investors. And almost always the first question the investors ask is, tell us something about yourself, which is them
Mm,
saying, we're happy to hear about what you built, but we don't actually invest necessarily in products as much as we invest in people. We want to know that you are a quality human being with passion and purpose and skills. And
mhm,
then once we know that, we'd love to hear what you're doing. But it's often flipped on this show where entrepreneurs believe that they should be leading with their product rather than leading with themselves. I think they should at least be married. I think they should at least come out together. If not, let us know a little about you before we learn about the thing you're doing. When
mm.
we love you, we are more likely to love the thing you're doing. And I think founders often make that mistake.
Definitely. I couldn't agree more. I mean, I host a small meetup in Shoreditch, which is our little, Silicon Valley in London. And then a lot of founders come and they talk about the features, products, and they never into like, they do have these teams slide on the deck, but that doesn't actually tell the story of the team members. It's more about what they have done, like, in terms of credibility, degrees, things like that. So I can definitely say, this is one of the things. I actually met a tech founder recently, who's startup was been acquired by Uber for around 200 million or something. He was debating with me because I'm a advocate of storytelling myself too, and he was like debating with me like, storytelling is just overrated, and there's literally, in some cases, there's literally no return on investment on storytelling. And I was like, what? That couldn't be possible. And I was like, in your experience, then, how does effective storytelling translate into tangible business outcomes? Do you have any examples which you could share with our audience?
Well, I mean, I'll start by telling you Steve Jobs said the most powerful person in the world is the storyteller. He
Mm,
understands that everything is framed through the lens of a story. So that is certainly important. My favorite example, is the Domino's pizza example. In 2009, Domino's ran a campaign where the founder of Domino's, sorry, the CEO of Domino's said, "Listen, our pizza is terrible. You've been
mhm,
telling us for years that our pizza is terrible, and we have pretended for a very long time that you were wrong. We finally decided that the customer is right. Our pizza is terrible." It's called the
mhm,
turnaround, this campaign they ran. And so essentially, they took us through the process of listening to customer complaints and meeting the chef, the head chef at Domino's, and watching them redefine their recipe, and then
mhm,
returning back to those same customers who complained about the product with the new product, knocked on their doors, let us see those people eat the pizza again, the new version of the pizza. And that campaign really did turn around that company. Now, if you invested in Domino's in 2009, you will be very happy today. Domino's has beaten the market since 2009, beaten
mhm,
the S&P. You make more money by investing in that company. Now, granted, they have done many, many things to become a successful company, but it began with a recipe. It began with the actual product tasting good. And that story that they told contained vulnerability, honesty. It's unforgettable if you see it. You never see a company sort of say, we're terrible, we're going to get better having listened to our customers. That turnaround story is tremendous. I think probably, I think when people say that storytelling is overrated, I think what they're really saying is, I'm a bad storyteller, but I've still made a lot of money Therefore,
Mm,
storytelling must be overrated. I think the failure in that statement is it's impossible to measure lost potential. It's
mm,
easy to say that my company is, has 4x'd itself over the last year without using any storytelling whatsoever. So storytelling must be useless. Whereas if they had told a good story about the product, if they had really reached customers using good stories, maybe they could have 6 or 7x'd it. But because they're successful absent storytelling, they make the assumption that it is useless when the whole world is run by stories. You can't get
definitely.
anything done unless you're communicating in an effective way to the people who matter most, whether it's, your customer, your clients, stakeholders, all of those people. So I think it's just a statement made probably by someone who's not a very good storyteller, yet is very successful in what they're doing.
Definitely, definitely. And on another note, Matthew, then I have looked into a lot of your TED talks online, and I was inspired by the way you communicate the stories. One of the stories I remember on top of my head that you're a teacher also in primary school, I guess.
Yes.
And
Yeah, to
then
this day I'm still teaching small children. Yeah.
wow. I mean, that must be amazing, right? I used to teach maths when I was in university to earn extra money. In colleges and universities, you require. How is your experience being with these small kids? How does they differentiate when you're introducing them with something new, some new concept compared to adults? What difference you see, and what we should learn from these kids?
I almost do nothing differently, honestly.
Hmm.
I think one of the advantages I've had as a storyteller is for the last 27 years that I've been teaching, I've stood in front of the worst audience on the planet, which is 8 to 10-year-old children, kids who genuinely don't want to be sitting in front of you most of the time.
Mm,
And so I am not the best teacher when it comes to curriculum or pedagogy. The way I teach students is I tell them stories. If I am teaching long division, I am going to start with a story. It's going to either be a story about how I failed at long division as a child, so I don't want you to fail as well, or it's going to be a story sort of related to complex processes and how important it is to master them. I'm going to tell them a story. It's probably going to be funny. It's probably going to be filled with stakes. It's probably going to be filled with surprise, but it's going to get them excited about what they are going to do. As a
mm,
business leader, I recommend people do the same thing. If you're standing at a keynote or an all hands or pitching your product, you should be doing exactly the same thing. You should be telling a story, perhaps being a little amusing, uh, landing tangible ideas in the audience's mind, trying to be unforgettable,
mm,
relentlessly creating sort of stakes and suspense and surprise, all of those things. So, when it comes to speaking to kids, the language might be a little simpler and the lessons might be a little more direct, a little less subtle than they are when I'm speaking to adults. I'm probably not going to swear when I'm speaking to children, although I have accidentally done that in the past. But otherwise, I'm trying to sell a product to those kids, and the product is long division. And I
mm.
do it in the same way I advise business people to sell their products too. I don't think there's any difference really.
Hmm. Interesting, interesting. Is there any? So I have read your books, also Storyworthy, etc., and I've learned quite a lot. But for the benefit or audience, what are the different tips on how busy entrepreneurs like who literally have zero time in their daily life can identify and document their stories, moments for in their daily lives?
Sure. Well, I'll first say they don't have zero time. If they have zero time, they're not using it effectively. I would ask all entrepreneurs, all human beings, I'd say, what is the meaning of 1,440? I've never
Mm,
actually met anyone who knows the meaning of that number. And it is quite simply the number of minutes there are in a day. But
exactly.
so often we carve our day into 24-hour blocks, maybe 48-hour blocks. Maybe we're doing 15-minute blocks at a time, but I think that 1 minute is just as valuable as 15 minutes. So there'll be time to do the work that I'm going to suggest. There's no one who has no time.
Mhm.
So the beauty of storytelling is you don't need a lot to capture stories. Every single day something is happening that is meaningful. And so, through what I call homework for life, I advise people to sit down every day for, let's say, 3 to 5 minutes, or in the midst of their day, quite honestly, and capture moments that have some meaning to them. Anything that sort of strikes them as different, odd, new, unusual, surprising. small little bits that we're looking for. So I'm not asking entrepreneurs or storytellers in general
Mm,
to write stories every day. You know, what I use is an Excel spreadsheet, two columns, really complicated, a
mm.
date on one side, and then I stretch that B column across my screen. And that is the place where I write down the thing that I noticed over the course of the day. And for me now, I'm finding about 7 or 8 moments per day that are worth recording,
Wow.
but even one would be great because most of the time we lose our days. You know, the reason why time flies, or the reason why people think time flies, is because they lose their days. And so, you know, if I asked you, tell me how many days you can remember from the year 2021, you know,
Wow.
even if you're really good, you probably remember 50 days, which means
Yeah.
you've taken a 365 day and reduced it to 50. And that's why it feels like time flies. Those
Mm,
of us who do homework for life and take account of every day, and sometimes take account in more than one way, sort of multiplying the moments over the course of a day, time doesn't fly for us. Time does not fly for me. It goes by very slow because every day gets a meaningful accounting of what is happening. Whether that is the one thing my son said that made me laugh, or the one thing I saw that was different that I've never seen before, whatever it is, I'm grabbing moments. And the thing that business people have to understand is we're not necessarily looking just for business stories. The
mm.
best stories we can tell in business are the analogies and the metaphors and the similes that explain what our business does, explain what we do, explain the features of our product. And oftentimes the best stories to tell in that regard are not actually business stories, but personal stories that we can then relate to the business or to the product that we're using. So every story has value. Every single story I can somehow, for a business person, convert it into a business story. We're just looking for moments in our lives. Hold on to those. Those will become the stories that you'll eventually be able to tell.
Mm, definitely, definitely. And I also wanted to pick your brain on the trend we are in right now in this, 21st century, where AI is around everywhere, right? It's transforming decision making processes for founders, businesses, even individuals. I mean, my granny, who doesn't even know how to use a smartphone, now have this button on her phone where she clicks it and speak in the native language, and this person replies back in the same language, and her mind is blown away because now she has somebody to talk to 24/7.
Yeah, it's
you know
amazing.
yeah, so how do you see AI transforming our decision making processes for, like, not just startup or small businesses, but for even individuals? What opportunities does it opens for first time founders, as well as well established businessmen like Warren Buffett, or I don't know, someone like Steve Foreman, or yourself if you're into business also.
Yeah. Well, it speeds up processes that didn't require a lot of thought, but required, unfortunately, a lot of manual labor. That's the way I use it, at least. You know,
Hmm.
people always ask me, how is AI going to affect storytelling? And I always say, it's fantastic for people like me. You know, large language models essentially take everything that's ever been said before and turn it into something that basically sounds like something that has been said before. There's a lack of creativity and originality in AI. You're going to
Hmm.
get wonderful content that sounds just like someone else's wonderful content. So the result of AI is most of the world is going to be like a lawn of freshly cut grass. And the only flowers that are going to emerge are the true storytellers, the ones that can make something from nothing, because AI is incapable of making something from nothing. It uses an enormous amount of information to make something that has essentially been made before. It's reproducing it, repackaging it, restating it, sort
Hmm.
of formulating it in a new way, but not really creating something from whole cloth. So,
Yeah, yeah.
as a business person, you know, I use it to write my emails because often don't require a lot of creativity, or at least they create the frame for my email that I will
Mhm.
then sort of tweak to make it sound like me and not AI. Because I think what's going to happen with human beings, I think it's already happening, is we can tell when something is written by AI. We can read it
Yeah.
and think, oh, AI wrote this, versus when an actual human being wrote something. I think the beauty is the actual human being content is going to stick out even more, and creative people are going to be valued in this world. I think that the B plus storytellers are going to be in a lot of trouble, but I
Mm.
think the A plus storytellers are actually going to shine to a greater degree than ever before.
Definitely, definitely. And a trick question here, maybe, and you don't have to answer this. Is there an AI which has the superpowers of Matthew Dix, whom I can reach out to and say, you know what, AI Matthew, can you craft a story for me? This is my business, this is my life, and then just to leverage the power of
I
experience.
think, yeah, I think if you did that, you would get a B plus story, which would be fine for
Mm,
most people. I think most people are not B plus storytellers. I think
mm,
most people at best are C plus storytellers. So I do think that using AI will increase the quality of your storytelling, but I also think it will decrease the uniqueness and creativity of your storytelling. Quite honestly,
mm,
I would probably rather have an original, creative, unique C plus story than an AI designed B plus story, because I think it's just going to lack some of the beauty and nuance. I once did a show at the Brooklyn Academy of Music for about 2,000 people. It was a
mhm,
big show for me at the time. And in the middle of my story, I made a mistake and I had to sort of double back to fix the mistake so I could finish the story. And it felt really clunky to me. I know the audience didn't even really know I had made a mistake. I'm good enough that I can sort of get myself out of trouble, but I was annoyed with myself. And I sat down
mm,
next to the director who was directing me that night, the director of The Moth, and she knew I made the mistake because she knew my story. And I sat
mm,
down and I sighed and said, "Oh, I can't believe I did that. I had to double back. It was ridiculous." And she told me, "Matt, the beauty is in the imperfection. The
mm,
imperfection tells the audience that you hadn't memorized a story, that you were telling them a story, that you had prepared and you knew what you wanted to say, but the sentences were not always going to come out the same. And that imperfection signals to them that this is not a monologue, but a real story being told by a real human being." And I think the same
mm,
applies in AI. I think we're going to see stories that have imperfections, and we're going to recognize imperfect stories as human stories, because that is how
mm,
most storytelling is done. So, I think all of these things will, again, help the superior storytellers become more valuable, more prized, more recognized. But I think that sort of the middling storyteller, the copywriters of the world who are desperately trying to stay ahead of AI or leverage AI, I think they're eventually going to be replaced by AI. Quite frankly,
mm, mm. Well, why do you think stories are so interesting for humans? Right? For example, if I'm going for a movie theater, I remember that story most of the time. But if I'm reading a conceptual science book, that's not that relevant. What is this? Do we have some kind of hormones in our brain because of which it's stuck? What is it? Why do we
yeah,
hear it and then store it?
there's a lot of reasons, but you're not wrong about the brain. For almost all of human existence, except for the last 1/4 of 1% of human existence, we were not able to write anything down.
Mm,
Writing and recording things is only a recent invention. So for almost all of human history, to pass information from one generation to the other, we told stories. And so we have evolved to be receptors of stories. If we do brain analysis tells us that if I tell you a story within a minute, your brain's going to release chemicals that are going to prime you to hear that story and remember it. It's going to release a chemical that will make you feel more connected to me. So even if
mhm,
you don't like me, you're going to not like me a little less than you did before. It
mm,
forces you to feel connected to me. There's also a chemical that gets released that improves cognition and comprehension, meaning you're more likely to remember my story. And a third chemical gets released that makes you feel better about the world in general as I'm telling you the story. So our brains are specifically wired for storytelling, and it's the only reason we exist as a species. There were a
mm,
lot of animals that could run us down and eat us back in the day. Before we had houses and Doritos and guns,
mm,
lions could just eat us at will almost. And the reason that they didn't was because we were the only species that could communicate information from one generation to the next. And so over
mm,
time, we became more effective at sort of taking over the planet. And that was through storytelling. So we don't need storytelling to survive today, from lions, but our brains, our ancient brains, are still wired for all of that, which is why you can remember a movie that you saw 30 years ago with almost perfect clarity. but we don't remember a single slide deck that we see. 10 minutes after someone shows you a pitch deck, you can't tell people what was on that pitch deck. Or if
Mhm.
I communicate to you in sentences, but I don't use story as a means of telling it, you're unlikely to remember it. It's why in this interview, people are more likely to remember me writing to Steven Spielberg about a
Mm.
problem with the movie E.T. That is what they will remember more than what they'll remember I'm saying right now, because what I'm
Mm.
saying right now is not embedded in a story. And so we remember the images that people plant in our minds, the dialogue, the emotion. Those are the things that people hold on to. Whereas if we don't attach communication to tangible, vivid scenes, storytelling, it is often forgotten. That's why we read
Mm.
nonfiction and we love the nonfiction that we read. But when we're finished reading the nonfiction, we often can't tell anyone more than maybe one or two things about a 300-page book that we just read.
Yeah.
Whereas read a novel, go see a Broadway musical, see a movie, you can probably give an account plot point by plot point of that film or that book or that show.
Even if you're in a pub and talking with your friends about a movie, and if that person says something wrong in the story, you can like, no, 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 it wasn't like that. You're wrong.
Right. Yes. You've never been in the pub though talking about a pitch deck,
No,
right?
no.
You've never been talking about someone's keynote in the pub or even a commercial. Unless that commercial told a story,
Mm.
even commercials are ephemeral. They disappear. Unless the ones tell stories, they stick with us for a long time too.
Yeah, yeah, and because you mentioned this, I recently went in a cinema hall, and in UK we have these ads before the movie starts, right?
Yeah.
And KFC had this very weird advertisement where the chicken is walking on the streets. I don't know if you have seen it, or they have just released it in Europe, and then everybody is following that chicken. I, in my head, thought that it's something related to politics because there's something weird going on in UK, and my partner is German, so she was thinking the same way. But at the end of the ad, it was like, believe in chicken. And we laughed so hard in the theater. Everybody looked at us. I was like, oh my God, what's happening here? I was like, very embarrassing. But yeah, that stuck to our brain.
Well, that created in your mind suspense, which is beautiful, right? It causes you
Hmm.
to wonder what's going to happen next. And human beings are prediction machines. We're
Hmm.
trying to get people to predict what will happen next. As soon as you predict what will happen next, you must know if your prediction is going to be true. So
Hmm.
that suspense created prediction. And then it created surprise at the end. And surprise is the most delightful and memorable thing that you can ever offer an audience.
Hmm.
And that surprise was wrapped in humor. So the laugh also releases the same chemicals that a story releases into your brain. So a brilliant ad that I will now have to go look for because it sounds like it's doing all the things that storytellers do.
Yeah, yeah, definitely, definitely. And on the same point, then, Matthew, would you be able to share a compelling story that highlights how entrepreneur, founder, or organization leverage your superpowers of storytelling to achieve success and solve their key business problems? And I would love to hear about the specific problems you're looking at in their message delivery or the message they were crafting, and the steps you have taken to like empower them with your superpowers.
Huh, sure. Well, I guess one of my favorite stories is I have so many. Well, I was working with a biotech in Boston. I guess this is my favorite story because
Hmm.
I like it when people go all in on storytelling. So I was working with a biotech that makes a lot of things. They manufacture products and they make medicines and they do a whole bunch of things.
Hmm.
I never understand what companies do to the complete extent, but I was working with their scientists. They had 5 scientists who were going to a conference, hoping to get sales leads. They were going to present each one of them the work that the company was doing, the products they were making, and a large audience of salespeople hopefully come back with some sales leads. And they asked me to help the scientists tell stories, which is often hard for a scientist because, like those technical entrepreneurs that are invested in the how of their product rather than the what and the why,
Hmm.
scientists are even worse. They want to tell you how the molecules came to be and how they designed their experiment, and nobody cares about anything like that. We just want to know what happened in the end. We just want to know that in the end there's a red pill and the red pill is going to save our lives. I don't care how you made it, but
Yeah.
scientists always want to tell you how.
Mm.
So I came in to help these scientists tell stories. They all told stories. They were all good, but the one that was my favorite was this guy, John. Uh, John needed to talk about these tubes that his division had designed. I can't quite understand what the tubes were for, except other companies were using these tubes in manufacturing processes and experimental processes. So they were selling tubes.
Mhm.
And essentially, the competitor to John's company, all the competitors, they sold one tube, and you would buy that tube and sort of retrofit it to your need.
Mhm.
John's company produced like 18 different tubes of all sizes and types. So if you buy from John's company, you're not going to have to do any retrofitting. You're going to get what you want. But John's tubes were more expensive. So it was a proposition of pay more money, but you won't have to fight with it as much. We'll give
Mm.
you exactly what you need. So when I sat down with John and I said, we have to find a story, I said, can you think about a time in your life, John, when having options, having choices has meant something to you? Essentially, I
Mhm.
was saying, let's not talk about science. Let's talk about something other than science and create an analogy, a metaphor. I call this speaking with adjacency. Let's talk
Mhm.
about the thing you want to talk about without talking about the thing you want to talk about. Right. And so John and I had some conversations and eventually we settled on a story. John said, oh, I know a place where choice matters, but is also kind of annoying to me. And so he tells a story. Essentially, the story is on Saturday mornings, he goes grocery shopping for his
Mhm.
family and
Mhm.
he hates it. And it begins in the produce aisle where he has to buy apples for his family, and that big table of apples with all those different types of apples, his family
Mhm.
can't agree on apples. So his
Mm.
son wants Cosmic Crisp, which is some kind of new apple that he has to go hunt and find for. And his daughter likes 4 or 5 different kinds of apples. He has to find Yellow Delicious all the time, which is an impossible to find apple. And his
Mhm.
wife is always saying, like, I need one Red Delicious and I want a couple Gala and I'm making a pie. So get me some Macintosh. He says he spends 15 minutes every Saturday morning just individually packaging apples and labeling the plastic bag with a Sharpie he brings to the grocery store just for this purpose. And it
Wow.
makes him crazy. He said, I waste so much time buying apples, but he says, I do it because I love my family and I want them to get exactly what they want. And
Mm.
then John says, that's what our company believes. He says, our competitors say, here's a Macintosh. It's all you're getting. Make do. Regardless
Mm.
of what you like, or regardless of the pies you're making, the juice you're making, take this Macintosh and deal with it. Our company believes you should get all the apples. You should have
Mm.
choice over what you want. We care enough about you to give you exactly what you want. That's the story he tells on stage. No science. He tells
Mm.
a story about apples and relates it to his product, and he walks off the stage.
Wow.
He ends up with more leads than the other 4 scientists combined. The
Mm.
interesting part, though, is when I meet with the vice president of marketing a few weeks later, she's initially really angry with me because I've sent a scientist into a scientific conference and he didn't report on science. He told a story about apples. She was
Mm.
really annoyed that I had stripped the science out of the story. And I had to remind her that he has more leads than the other 4 scientists combined. The reason
Exactly.
she was really angry was because I had essentially challenged her and pointed out that the way she's been doing business for 25 years, the way she's built up her career in science, might not be the best way to sell your
Okay.
products. I
Mm.
pointed out to her now that John has all these leads, he's going to be able to explain the science on the follow-up phone calls he's going to have and the meetings he's going to have. Eventually, they're going to get to the science. People do
Yeah.
want to understand the science. But again, top of the funnel, nobody wants science at the top of the funnel. They want to understand what you do and why it is important to me. The how comes much further down. And it's
Down.
usually not the customer, it's usually some compliance person who needs to figure out the how to make sure that, okay, this product that you like, it is good too. We confirm that you can go ahead and make that purchase.
Mm.
But that's an example of people doing business one way. I showed them how to do it another way. And to that vice president's credit, after about 20 minutes of she and I arguing back and forth in front of a team of about 20 people, she finally threw some papers down on the desk and she said, damn it, I think you're right. Which was her acknowledgement that like the way she's been doing business has been fine. But
Yeah.
again, you can't measure lost potential. For
Mm.
25 years, her company's been doing business one way and they have been successful. But I showed them a different way where they could be possibly, at least at times, even more successful. And she eventually bought into that way. That's essentially
Mm.
what I'm doing every day with clients, whether it is a tech company or a manufacturer, or even sort of when I'm working with an Olympic athlete, and they're delivering motivational speeches. The
Mm,
idea that just because you won a gold medal doesn't really mean you're telling a good story. It's really just the thing that got you in the door. You now have to tell a story that probably contains some failure, some embarrassment, some shame, and then eventually some success, because we do want to hear how you won the gold medal. But these are stories that people have to learn how to tell. They're doing fine right now, but they're not doing as well as they could be.
they could be, yeah, yeah, great stuff. Matthew, I'm loving this conversation so much that I want to go on and go on, but like we are restricted with time. So before we go into our lightning round, I've got like six quick fire question for you. I have a personal question, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Throughout your journey and experiences, there must have been some valuable lessons learned, right? Like, if you don't mind sharing, could you reflect on your experience and tell us about one mistake or a setback that you encountered along the way? And then I don't want to use the word regret because it's taken negatively, in our space, but a setback. And what advice would you give our listeners based on this experience?
Well, I'll tell you, I have no problem with regret, you know. And if you have a problem with regret, you probably have a regret that you're hiding from.
Mm,
You've shoved under a rock thinking that it doesn't exist, but it does exist, unfortunately for you, and
mm.
that is simply the case. Are you wondering about something in my business life or just in life in general?
In general, in your personal life, because
Sure.
this is like my one-to-one question to
Okay.
you. Yeah, yeah.
Well, that's easy then. It comes to mind right away because I understand regret and I'm not afraid to
Hmm.
stare it in the face. When I was a kid, I guess from the ages of like 10 to 18, I was a Boy Scout. It was
Hmm.
probably the most important thing I ever did in my life. My wife often says, I think you learned more from Boy Scouts than you did from school, based upon, you know, me understanding things and constantly imparting wisdom to her. She just can't believe everything that I learned while being a Boy Scout. And it was everything to me. I was a kid who didn't get a lot of attention from his parents, even from his teachers. But in Boy Scouts, I got enormous attention. I became a patrol leader and a senior patrol leader. Like, I rose the ranks and I earned all the merit badges. I did everything you needed to do to be successful as a Boy Scout and received tons of recognition for it. And my goal
Mm,
was to become an Eagle Scout, which is the highest rank that can be attained, and very few people actually attain that rank. And I completed every requirement except for a service project, a simple project I had to do to make my community better. And I waited to complete
mm,
the service project. You can't become an Eagle Scout until you're 16. And so I became 16 and I could have done my service project, but I was dating girls and driving cars. And I just knew there would be time.
mm,
And then I was 17 and I started planning the project. And 2 days before Christmas, I went through the windshield of a car in a head on collision. I wasn't
oh
wearing a
no.
seatbelt, 17 years old. I died in the back of an ambulance, and the CPR brought me back to life. I ended up in a hospital for a long time, badly injured, requiring surgery. And while all that was happening, I turned 18 years old. And once you turn 18, you can't be an Eagle Scout anymore. The clock runs
Mm,
out on you. And so, because I procrastinated and then failed to put a seatbelt on and went through a windshield, I failed to become an Eagle Scout. It remains my life's greatest regret. It was a dream and a goal I had for a very long time that I failed to achieve. Now, I'll tell you, a month ago, at the age of 53, I completed my service project. In an effort
wow.
to alleviate my regret, I organized a cemetery cleanup in a cemetery that my son and I like to walk through and look at the stones and place flags on Memorial Day. My original project when I was 17 was the cemetery cleanup. I was going to
Mm,
improve the quality of a cemetery in my hometown. So last month I improved the quality of a cemetery in the hometown I have now. And, I had about 60 volunteers, many who I didn't know, but sort of read what I was doing and decided to come
mhm,
and help. And we spent all day cleaning stones and getting rid of moss and beautifying the cemetery. My goal was to maybe feel better about the failure and maybe release myself from the regret that I have felt for so long. That hasn't happened yet, to be quite honest, because it turns out that doing that service project was not that difficult.
mm,
I gathered some people together, I purchased some supplies, I bought some donuts, I set up a table, I got access to water. It really wasn't that hard to do. And in doing it, I recognized how easy it would have been for me to do it at the age of 17 too. How I failed to do something simple
Mm,
that could have been accomplished quickly and I could have reached my goal. So, I mean, the lesson I learned from that is I am relentless in my attempts to achieve my goals. I do not delay anymore. If I'm,
mm,
I'm an author of novels and nonfiction, and there isn't a day go by that I don't put pen to paper or, fingers to keys,
mm,
because I have a million stories to tell and I have a limited amount of time on this planet and I want to get as many out as I can. And on my deathbed at the age of 250, hopefully, I want to look back and think I used every single day wisely. As a kid, I did not use every single day wisely. I should have just done
mm,
that project when I had the chance. My wife will remind me that I didn't have any parental support. No one was helping me. I was very much on my own for much of my childhood. And she is correct. And yet I was still capable of doing that project and I failed to do it. So that is my life's regret, is failing to earn Eagle Scout, despite the fact I had every requirement completed, more than I ever needed to have it completed. And yet one simple little thing at the end spoiled it for me. But I'm hoping that the thing I did last month in the cemetery will eventually settle in and
mm.
make me feel better about that experience. I'm just waiting for that process to
Yeah, yeah, no,
hopefully happen.
definitely.
But that was the one. That's the painful one.
Yeah, and the message here is to make sure what you want to do it. Don't procrastinate because later on you might regret about it. So
You
why
can
not
go
do
through a
it?
windshield at any time.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Great stuff. All right, Matthew. Let's get into our lightning round. I've got 6 quick fire questions for you, and you
Okay.
can answer them as quickly as possible. Great. Number one, what's the top 3 strategies to create stories in 2024, 2025 for founders you would advise?
I would say that you have to know what you're aiming at the end of the story, and it has to be a moment of change. So you have to say
Mhm.
something meaningful in the last minute of your story, otherwise you failed. You should begin your story with location and action, because that signals to an audience that you're telling a story, activates imagination, and gets people excited about your story. And if you can be at least slightly amusing, humor in some way opens hearts and minds, lowers defenses, and makes people excited about what you're saying.
Perfect. Perfect. That is going to be like a benchmark from now on when I'm creating any deck in my life. Great. Number two, what book would you recommend to our audience and why?
I guess I'd recommend Made to Stick by Chip and Dan Heath. It's a
Hmm.
book that came out years and years ago. It's the best teaching book that exists and one of the best storytelling books that exists. It's a book about making sure your ideas are remembered, which is essentially what every storyteller wants to do. So it's not about storytelling, except it's exactly about storytelling. It's not about teaching, but exactly about teaching. It's a book I reread every single year, and I recommend it to every teacher and business owner that I come in contact with.
I'm going to add it into my reading list now. What one attribute or characteristic in your mind of a successful founder?
Uh, I guess the most successful attribute that I have found with founders is the willingness to acknowledge the need for growth.
Mm,
Especially founders who are successful. I work with very successful business people in the world, very
mm,
high up, leaders. And
mm,
the ones I work with who are the best in my mind are the ones who come to me and say, I have a lot to learn. I need to
mm,
learn a lot more. And I'll tell you, the athletes or the former athletes who are now in business, they're the most extraordinary of all of them. For some
mm,
reason, athletes are coded in such a way that they see improvement as an enormous opportunity and treat it in the same way they treated their athletics. They treat
mm,
storytelling like they used to shoot 100 free throws a day or run the hurdles or, run the marathon. They treat it as if it is a skill that can be required through strategy and tactics and practice. So, entrepreneurs who acknowledge they have a lot of room to grow, those tend to be the ones that I think are most successful.
great stuff. What's your favorite personal productivity tool or habit?
Well, I guess the habit I'll give people, I wrote a book on personal productivity. It's called Someday is Today. And I think I think the thing that probably helps me more than anyone is the value of the minute.
Mm,
Meaning, if it's 3 minutes before a meeting or 3 minutes before a podcast is about to begin and I'm recording that interview, if I'm sitting at my desk, I'm not looking at my phone. I'm not engaging in nonsense. I
mm,
make a list of things that I can do in 1 to 10 minutes that are productive for me. And so, I have a book, Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. I love this book. It's filled with small, bite-sized tidbits. I own 3 copies of it, and I have
mhm.
it in 3 strategically placed positions in my home, including on this desk. So, if
Oh,
I
wow.
have 3 minutes, I can open up Marcus Aurelius's Meditations and learn something from a man who was living 2,000 years ago. But I also have
Mhm,
just I have thank you notes and other notes positioned all over my house. So if I have a minute, I can quickly whip off a thank you note. It's the idea that minutes matter. The habit I
mhm,
want people to get into is the idea that stop wasting your minutes. Stop
mm,
carving your day into segments. Stop believing that you can't accomplish something unless you have 10, 15, or 30 minutes. 1 minute can be exceptionally useful if you prepare yourself in a way to make it useful. So do that, and you'll find that you get a lot more done.
mm. Definitely, definitely. Great stuff. Um, it's not related to exactly you, but if you had to, like, say, for example, if you had some time, what's a new or a crazy business idea you would love to pursue if you had time and interest in it?
Wow. A new or crazy business idea that I would like to pursue if I had time. Well, I have a stupid idea
Hmm.
that I've solved for. I live in New England, and in the autumn, leaves fall on the grass. And now I just hire someone to come and take care of it. My wife has convinced me, stop raking the leaves, Matt. You can make
Mm,
more money being inside working with a client while someone else rakes your leaves. So I have a company that comes and takes care of my lawn now. But for a long time, when I was raking leaves for, a decade or two, I often thought in September, if I could get like a net, a very thin, fine, strong enough net, and stretch it out across my lawn so that I allowed the leaves to fall for a month onto
mm,
the net, and then I simply pick up the 4 corners, bring them together, tie it off, and drag my leaves off. I would never have to rake anything if I just could prepare my lawn with this net. Now, admittedly, like my kids wouldn't be able to play on the lawn for that month, but too bad. Maybe they can play on the front lawn. But I've always had that idea of there's got to be a better way to collect these leaves than the
mm,
way I am doing right now. And so I spent many a day raking leaves, imagining creating this net that can be sized according to your lawn that collects leaves and you can drag them away very simply. I think it's probably a terrible idea, but it does also feel like a great idea also. So if
I,
someone
I,
wants to take that idea and run with it, go for it. I would love to see
yeah,
that happen.
I don't think so. It's a bad idea at all, Matthew, because we spend quite a lot of money on these companies for taking care of it, right? So if somebody can come up with some solution, that would be great. And last but not least, so everybody knows you're a great storyteller, you're a public speaker, you help businesses and everything. But what's an interesting or fun fact about you that most people don't know?
Oh, there's so many. Well, the one I told my students on Friday was I had a pet raccoon when I was a child.
Wow.
My father was chopping down trees one day with some of his friends for firewood, and there happened to be a raccoon's nest in one of the trees. And
Hmm.
when the tree fell, the mother died, and some of the babies died, but a few survived the fall. And so the people working that day each took one of these baby raccoons in hopes of raising it and keeping it alive, which we did. And so I had a pet raccoon named Racket who loved me more than anyone, and was my pet for a very long time until Racket got so large and so sort of wild that the only person that he ever allowed to sort of interact with was me. So Racket and I always got along, but he began
Hmm.
biting and clawing at my brother and sister, and my parents got wary of having a wild animal, even in a cage. Raccoons have hands, so
Yeah,
you
yeah,
can't really
yeah.
keep them in a cage because he always managed to find a way to get out, and then he
Mm,
would tear the screens open in our house, and I'd find him sleeping in my bed at night next to me. A wild
mm,
animal essentially. So, eventually my parents told me one day that Racket escaped and ran away into the forest. And I found out later that was not really the case. Really, they brought him out into the forest and released him. And I still saw him from time to time because I grew up on a horse farm without horses. It was a farm where the horses were gone and it was an empty barn. And I would see a raccoon from time to time in the barn.
Wow.
And, I assume it was probably Racket,
Mhm.
who had become so wild that he wouldn't come to me anymore, but still understood that this was a place that might be safe for him. So,
Mhm.
yeah, I had a pet raccoon as a kid, which when I
Awesome.
told my students, they said, "Of course you did, because everything seems to happen to you."
Great stuff, Matthew. Matthew, thank you so much for joining me and sharing your, story, unpacking all these amazing ideas. If people want to get in touch with you, founder want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do it? To get in touch.
Sure. Yeah. If they go to matthewdix.com, or if you're just interested in storytelling, storyworthy.com, both of those places will get you to me and all of the things that I do.
Awesome. Matthew, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your inspiring journey and the impactful work you're doing by teaching people how to tell stories. Right? It's amazing. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on Founders Podcast.
Same here. My pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thank you all for tuning into this episode of Founders Podcast. I hope you found our conversation with our guests insightful and inspiring. If you're a founder or industry expert interested in sharing your story on our podcast, please don't hesitate to reach out. Simply email me at ash@artcircles.com and let's connect for a potential interview opportunity. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe to our podcast and stay updated on future interviews with proven founders and industry experts. We have a lineup of incredible guests and valuable insights coming your way. Stay inspired, stay motivated, and keep building.